So good morning. I have been on a plane for a long time, but it's lovely to be here. It's really lovely to be here, and I thank you, Liam, for this kind introduction and this really fantastic invitation to join FuturEd and the FuturEd Shakespeare Conference. I say it like that, FuturEd. Does that sound FuturEd? I don't know. I'm still working on it. The conference to me is a great opportunity for me to learn from you all, or as we would say in Texas, y'all. And to connect with other teachers who teach Shakespeare plays in these complicated political times, and to have an idea to the future, not just reverence for the past, given the focus of our digital age. My career has been in teaching future teachers and researching in an amalgamation of social science and literary scholarship how and why literature study matters in the education of adolescents. Throughout, I've incorporated and tried to understand the impact of the evolving digital tools. Once, when I was teaching in Norway, I was asked, do you believe in teacher education? And I do. I know from my own professional life and those of my students that teachers develop best in dynamic partnerships that include complex tensions between theory and practice. These partnerships are very much what I admire about the Better Strangers program. So I've gotten to read up on things from the vast website that's available, which now apparently is going to be much more vaster with all the things here. In my work, it seems best to call the latest generations of students 21st century learners. That's partly because I got tired of trying to track millennial, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, whatever. So 21st century learners is what I want to talk about. And in fact, I think we are all 21st century learners. My intention here, though, is to focus on students in schools and the schools which are immersed in or perhaps riding out enormous and dynamic change, the disruptive technologies that I am referencing in my title here. So the University of Houston, where I've been now, this is my 6th year of teaching there, is the second most ethnically diverse research university in the United States. And students come to the University of Houston from more than 137 countries. Although many of them are from other countries, but they're living in Houston, and Houston is their hometown university. And many of them want to teach and stay at home, but home represents many places, which is a fantastic dynamic. I try to listen carefully to my students about their lives and the lives of the secondary students in schools around the city. There are stories about textbooks replaced by online learning management systems and other exciting technology investments. But there are also stories about kids who get backpacks full of food to take home on weekends to make up for the meals that they miss when the school is closed. And it seems to me that worldwide teachers and schools are not only experiencing disruptive technologies, but also waves of accountability pressures. And I realize you can blame the US for some of these, which we could talk about. But these pressures don't do much good for the students who are distracted by hunger or other insecurities. Societal pressures are everywhere, and so teaching matters as we help students thrive in the immediate world and dream of what might be in their futures. And again, that's why I'm so pleased to be with this group this weekend. When I taught, so this is the book about which we were just speaking. When I taught in Arizona, I had the tremendous luck of having a great colleague and friend, Dr. Ayanna Thompson, my co-author, who was aggravated about Shakespeare teaching at the same time that I was. I told her about observing a student teacher who loved Julius Caesar so much that he talked about the play and the characters and why they were so interesting for almost an hour straight, oblivious to the students asleep in front of him. And Ayanna told me about a graduate student who similarly was so eager to prove her expertise to undergraduates that she outlined theoretical frameworks in brilliant but basically inaccessible language, and then wondered why, after listening quietly for so long, the students just didn't understand. Teacher knowledge and even passion is insufficient. The most fabulous presentations or demonstrations of great skills in literary analysis are still transmission strategies, too focused on the expertise of teachers and not on the responsibilities of students to be learners. So Ayanna and I wrote this book together, a Shakespeare scholar and a social scientist. We argue that there are many reasons to love Shakespeare, but that the purpose for teaching Shakespeare is that students need to gain an independent facility with complex texts. They need to read competently and critically to be truly grown up. Shakespeare doesn't need defending, but we decided this anyway, but engagement and facility with complex texts do. That book and this talk are focused on the many strategies, some old and some new, that teachers can use to support students as they make connections to the plays and learn to understand the works for themselves. I am not here to preach to you about why I think Shakespeare matters. In a culture that is learning to honor many voices and recognize minority perspectives that have long been ignored, scholars continue to figure out what to think about the values that are presumed to be found in Shakespeare plays. Professor John Guillory at the University of New York describes Shakespeare as a monument, high on a plinth, set up on a pedestal to be honored in bronze or stone to represent the enduring contribution and importance. Guillory notes, however, that while the bust of Shakespeare in his English department office is certainly prominent, it is also sometimes made to wear hats, seasonal hats, and disguises and suffer other indignities. Shakespeare represents something to be honored, but perhaps not to be taken too seriously. I'm going to let others argue about whether Shakespeare is more cultural baggage or essential cultural capital. I think those are really interesting questions. But what I'm worried about is that in secondary schools, Shakespeare plays are not only monumental, our students also seem to see a moat around the monument. In schools that have focused on literacy, test prep, sadly, at the expense of literature, regular students encounter almost nothing as difficult or distant as Shakespeare plays. And without real efforts from teachers, the students resist these works. They are disinclined to honor text just because they once meant something to somebody, but which don't seem particularly relevant to their dynamic young lives. They are missing out on what could matter to them because they don't have the tools to make sense of it. In fact, Shakespeare's part in the U.S. curriculum for secondary students has been contentious for a while, and it's an interesting problem of teaching. In English Journal published in 1912, which is kind of on the far left here, there are articles about teaching Shakespeare with new approaches in 1912, and this is partly because in the previous century, Shakespeare's speeches had been taught as rhetoric without the plays or any other context, because drama itself was understood to be seductive and dangerous. But in 1912, as this journal, the English Journal, was just being founded, U.S. English language arts teachers were already enjoining one another about improving Shakespeare teaching. And as these magazine covers suggest, it's been that way ever since. Teachers say, through the years, to each other, let's liven it up, folks. Let's get the text off the page. Let's get the kids on their feet. We know it doesn't work to just tell kids Shakespeare, and we've known that for a long time. I want to add that I'm excited to be part of the continuing dialogue about good practice that's represented by this journal. This is the publication of the U.S. National Council for Teachers of English. And the English Journal now, this in the current volume, has a column called Teaching Shakespeare that I co-edit with Ann Christensen, my colleague from University of Houston. And although it tends to be a U.S.-focused journal, we would love to talk to you about your ideas. And so if you come to the deep dive session, we could talk about your classrooms and what you might want to tell U.S. teachers about how you're teaching Shakespeare. Especially when it comes to Shakespeare plays, making meaning is not easy. A Shakespeare play in a U.S. secondary school classroom is often taught as a story, albeit a complex one, a text to be told and explained. Students understandably resist the ancient language, and too often the teaching reinforces the idea that a complex text is best left to an expert for translation. There are common cures to the difficulty of Shakespeare plays, in U.S. classrooms anyway. One of them is No Fear Shakespeare, this series which are modern-day translations rendered into very simple language. Also watching the movie as the answer. But mostly, even in great classrooms, teachers are telling students what happens and why it matters. These are lovely, heartfelt teacher efforts, but it's not work that's going to lead to independent readers who have skills and strategies for making sense of complex text. And in fact, it's because of the experiences of students as connected to the world online that 21st century learners want something different than to be told what Shakespeare's all about. Ayanna Thompson and I looked at the research on emerging e-connected participatory culture, Jenkins and G and some others I can talk to you about, which pays attention to students who are engaged in learning both in and out of schools. As a result, in our book, we identify 4 assumptions that our students as 21st century learners make about what learning is, and make about what learning is, whether or not it's learning that's happening in schools. Students expect to follow divergent paths to information and gain knowledge through accessing many sources. Students expect to form as well as function in informal learning communities, large and small, to share their ideas and create new things together. Students expect to explore and express their identities. Students expect to demonstrate their learning in creative multimodal ways. If we're going to pay attention to 21st century learners when they are in our schools, we have to make decisions about the role of technology in our classrooms. Phones and laptops and tablets, and the questions are they left at the door or are they invited in to a Shakespeare classroom? In the US, there are many opinions about the right role of digital tools in the classroom, and the cell phone, and particularly access to social media like Twitter, for instance, is one of the biggest challenges that we're talking about. Some school leaders are desperate to help teachers control the many distractions that are offered, as well as control the questionable content, et cetera, that's available. At the same time, other schools and systems have become comfortable with BYOD ideas, which is bring your own device in the US, bring your own device to take advantage of student access and connectivity. You don't have to invest in as many computers if they have them on their hands. The student teachers in Houston, the future teachers that I work with, see a wide range of practices and policies as they go to different schools, some right down the street from each other. These pictures in this slide are ones that my students took of the different systems teachers are using to either store phones or confiscate them or communicate when phones are supposed to be tools for learning or when they're not. So we sort of send them out as spies in the schools to see what's going on, see what's happening. So maybe if teaching is too much telling, teaching Shakespeare is too much telling, and if we're ambivalent, if not entirely resistant to new digital tools, maybe we do need some disrupting as teachers, at least as the tech geniuses define disruption, as something positive, as innovations that cause us to rethink our assumptions about the best ways for learning that should be happening in our classrooms. One intended disruptor of whole class delivered teacher-centered instruction is personalized learning. This is a very hot topic right now in US schools. These clips are just from recent emails I've gotten, and you can see inviting me to come and transform my attitude about personalized learning, etc. And you can see maybe in the lower left-hand corner, data, data, data. With data, learning is individualized. With data, this. With data, data, data. As if, we'd never heard of paying attention to our students before. But anyway, so this is very hot, and we could say many more things about that. But anyway, there is an increasing emphasis, though, on tools that promote individual learning. And sometimes this means tools that customize learning experiences, and other times this means tools that automate learning experiences. Personalized learning, stereotypically anyway, is an individual in front of a screen, and the learning management software assesses you, the student. The learning management software assesses you as you interact with the material and primarily answer questions that it asks you. And meanwhile, an algorithm expects and tracks your progress and presumably knows when to reward you, when to make you redo work, when to challenge you, etc. So I don't know what we're doing during this time, but that's what's happening, right? So the question is personalized Shakespeare. And I want to talk about some of the tools to help us think about what personalized Shakespeare could even be. Students may be able to learn about Shakespeare plays through personalized learning, but I want us to be ambitious for more than that. while the digital tools I want to talk about here can support individualized and even Shakespeare learning, in fact, these tools need good teaching to be more than just another way of having Shakespeare plays told to students, told to anyone. There are digital tools that can support Shakespeare study and bridge between engaging classroom practices like active theater-based practices and teach it so that can bridge between that and teaching that therefore takes advantage of 21st century learning preferences. I'm going to show you some screenshots of these and talk particularly about one that I've studied, but we can look at these platforms in more detail in the deeper dive session if you're interested, and I have a lot of links up and I'm happy to share further if you want access to some of this. So Wordplay Shakespeare is an ebook that I know the best. Wordplay Shakespeare was created by Alexander Parker and the New Book Press, which he founded. They are working, as his team are working, their primary interest is to imagine what the 21st century text should evolve into. So he's really thinking about the book, which is interesting because these are, of course, plays. There are currently 3 wordplay Shakespeare editions. There's Macbeth, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Romeo and Juliet. The ebook allows a play to be experienced simultaneously as a script and as a performance. The text is presented in one window, side by side on the screen with a synchronized film production created specifically for its use in this platform. As the Wordplay Shakespeare website notes, it is designed both for the iPad and web browsers, and now half the page is a stage. So it's kind of clever. The text side of the screen is empty of glosses or footnotes. There are tabs to get to them, but basically you can see what a student would see here. There is a translation tab that can open up and give you a guidance text version in modern English. It pops up on another screen that actually covers over the film at that time and but overall it displays a version that's rendered to follow the Shakespeare text line by line. And it's kind of interesting, too, when you get to the end of the page, you also are at the end of the clip. And so you must turn to the next screen in order to get to the next part of the play and the next part of the production. It's exactly synchronized. The staging is intentionally spare, with unobtrusive camera work and minimal costuming in contemporary dress. There are swords in Romeo and Juliet, and there are plaid sashes and blood in Macbeth. But otherwise, there are very few props and no scenery. The action is shot against a white background, as you can see. And Alexander and the team were very consciously trying to have as transparent an interpretation as possible, so as to make it as little telling and as mostly just enacting the play as possible. I interviewed teachers in a school district that had adopted Wordplay, and while none of their classrooms utilized the ebooks in the same way, each teacher described students benefiting from this simultaneous text and film. Some teachers projected it on a classroom screen. These teachers described the Wordplay combination of text and performance as more useful for student understanding and more engaging of student attention than their usual methods, which included students reading aloud from the textbook or following along in the textbook while listening to an audio recording. One pilot teacher described Wordplay as, quote, putting less pressure on the students. The teachers agreed that they liked that they did not have to listen to students slowly mangle the words. One teacher noted that it was usually challenging to determine how or when to intervene as students struggled with pronunciation. In contrast, she said, Wordplay allowed the actors to do their jobs, which she liked. At least 2 teachers chose to use a classroom set of iPads to enable students to individually access Wordplay. These teachers reported that students appreciated being able to move through the text at their own rate and level. These teachers believed that Wordplay delivered independently on iPads offered a significant opportunity for differentiation amongst diverse levels of learners. Generally, the focus group teachers agreed students whom they usually saw shut down and turn off when assigned difficult readings seemed more engaged. Teachers who reported they had been skeptical about doing Shakespeare in lower literacy ability classrooms said they believed students were less likely to give up in confusion or put their heads down on their desks in defeat. Some teachers, several teachers, utilize wordplay in classroom instruction in more ambitious ways. For instance, ways that integrated rehearsal room techniques and dramatic exercises, and then this wordplay app. They saw students pay attention to directors' and actors' choices in the wordplay production. One teacher noted that some students used the ebook's productions for staging ideas, while others were eager to try out an entirely different take on the action. They basically criticized what they saw in the ebook. Because a specific scene and its performance was easy to find, students had examples for how action and movement were the result of what was implied or suggested in the text. When the teachers had the students enact the scene themselves, they watched the students experiment with expression of their own adolescent conflicts while referencing the ebook production. In addition to supporting close and active reading, the Shakespeare ebook supported creative projects. And students gained expressive as well as analytic skills. One teacher I observed adopted the character committee assignments from Shakespeare Set Free, a series by Peggy O'Brien, came out in '93. And these students used iMovie, which was on the class iPads along with Wordplay, to create trailers for imagined films for Midsummer Night's Dream centered on Hermia, Oberon, Puck, and other characters. This work, this activity, unleashed creative ideas of all kinds. There was a stop-action chase through a Lego-built forest. Aegeus was illustrated in another one by clips from a certain presidential campaign and news stories. And also students cast their favorite teachers as Hermia and Lysander. Some willingly and others not so much. Oberon was portrayed in a prismatic selection of Google images and mashups, including screenshots that the students took from the ebook. So they played off the different portrayals of the characters and were not limited to what they had seen in the Wordplay production. At the end of the Shakespeare unit, some classes assigned groups to create a video production to demonstrate how A Midsummer Night's Dream connected to their contemporary world. Several video projects, I have to admit, created variations on Keeping Up with the Athenians, which, yeah, you know what that was. To portray the entangled and bickering lovers. Some students gave the characters a chance to explain their feelings to each other in modern terms, while others chose to incorporate the original text. Their production experiments enabled them to capture dreams' adventures in the woods as they understood and imagined them. So they seemed that much more excited about creating the text, creating things with the text as a result of their access. My Shakespeare is another platform. It's a different platform. It was created to help even advanced students feel confident about Shakespeare plays. This one, My Shakespeare, is actually created by Greg Watkins and a team at Stanford University, which is a very high-level university in the U.S., but he felt that his undergraduates at Stanford were having trouble being confident about what was going on in the play, so they created this series, My Shakespeare. And interesting or useful to you, perhaps, this is free on the internet as opposed to Wordplay, which requires a license. We'll talk about that later. And you can see the range of plays that are available: Hamlet, Caesar, Macbeth, Romeo and Juliet, and Shrew. My Shakespeare has more audio than video. It has some video clips, and it does, once again, the text follows along with the audio. It's all synced up. It includes pop-up notes that include glosses and background information on Shakespeare's life and times. So it does a little more contextualizing, a little less producing. And so you can kind of see what a typical one looks like here with a popped-up, in this case, a popped-up translation, if you will. The other thing you might want to notice at the bottom of this particular screen, but it is throughout the play, is that there are interviews with the characters in the scenes. So in this case, what you can click on at the bottom of this one is Romeo being interviewed specifically about his relationship to the apothecary from whom he's just bought the poison that's going to carry forward the plot, etc. My student teachers, future English teachers, were trying out this platform both for themselves and with some of their classrooms. And they were excited to use these interviews as models for their students to create. This is Romeo being interviewed here in this pop-up screen. And they saw, my students saw how these interviews were great examples of how to stay close to the text, but still put their own spin on the motivations and attitudes of characters. So they're not wide-ranging interpretations, but they help to explain and kind of clarify what's going on in the different scenes without doing too much interpretation. You could theorize what is being interpreted, but it's still really interesting, sort of transparent within the scene. There are others. Again, some of these I've only played with a little bit. Some of these may be super familiar to you already. This is Shakespeare in Bits. I believe it's from Ireland, or from the creators are from Ireland. I don't know that for absolute sure. Animated, so it's an animated version of Romeo and Juliet, although if you watch it as a film, you'll see it's influenced by other films. And there's actually some writing that's been done by Gina Bloom on Macbeth, which puts Lady Macbeth in a bathtub at one point, which is directly out of another film. But anyway, it is animated in this sense. Again, like the other platforms, allows you to pop back and forth to different scenes and move around. And what I've learned about this platform, it is behind a paywall, so you can only see sample scenes of it. But apparently it's very popular with homeschooling parents in the U.S. This has spread widely because of homeschooling, or through homeschooling networks. And I don't know why, but I'm kind of interested in that. I'm trying to sleuth out what's happening, or why maybe the cartoon version is safer, or who knows what. But anyway, it's interesting. Also, what's still under development but pretty interesting is the Stratford, Ontario Shakespeare Festival has begun a part of its online platform under education has what they're calling Performance Plus. And in this case, they take films of their productions and then they add the text, as you can see on the left, and also directors' commentaries about lines that they've kept or lost. So it gives you a very interesting perspective on the particular production that you're watching and what was decided or not decided as this goes through. So you watch the scene and you watch the text scroll by, but you can understand what's there and also what's not there. And this is the homepage of a Shakespeare app that was created by Heuristic Media, actually in partnership with Bloomsbury Arden. And it was supposed to be the first of an entire Shakespeare series, but to my knowledge, this is the only one that's available so far, which is Tempest. And this one is Shakespeare done with famous actors, Ian McClellan, Derek Jacobi, and others. And in each case, instead of left-right, it's top-bottom. So the actor's on the front who's just looking out directly into the camera and saying the lines, wearing modern dress, saying the lines, and then the lines actually scroll beneath them. But there's no production involved. It's just the individual speeches as you work your way through them. So Wordplay, My Shakespeare, Shakespeare in Bits, Performance Plus, this at Heuristic Media's Tempest, you get kind of a sense of the world as it may be developing, as what I've seen so far. And there are some pitfalls. There are some things that we have to worry about. Even what I described earlier about what I saw in Wordplay probably gives you some sense of that. I understand the worries that these digital tools will be just another way of making Shakespeare easy and missing the point about students learning to take on complex texts. Of course, what matters is what teachers do with these technologies if they're using them in the classroom. Peggy O'Brien, who created this kind of spiral thing, it's what she calls her Unfinished Taxonomy, is the director of education at the Folger Shakespeare Library, which is in Washington, D.C., and which I believe has 143 copies of the first folio. It is quite a library if you can get there. It's a center for great teaching, and it combines, and her work particularly combines scholarship and theater. Their mantra, the mantra at Folger is "On Your Feet, Shakespeare." where students learn through enacting and embodying the text, and teachers are given lots of strategies for student engagement that integrates that active Shakespeare with all the literacies. Nonetheless, as O'Brien shows in this diagram, Folger has drawn a line in the sand about digital teaching technologies, and because of the fear that the digital tool does too much work for the students and makes the learning too passive. I admire their focus, putting Shakespeare's words, as you can see, at the very center of what matters. But I don't think it's fair to put these technologies out in the suburbs with the turkey legs. I don't know if you can see this. This is a reference to going to Renaissance fairs. Do you have Renaissance fairs? Yeah, and eat the turkey legs, right? So that's as the favorite food of Renaissance people everywhere, I guess. But anyway, so Peggy, when she makes this taxonomy, right, the very center is Shakespeare words, and then the suburbs is like as far as you can get from what matters. And you can see what she puts way out there, and those are, in some ways, fighting words. But the technology is a recent addition to this taxonomy, and it comes directly from discussions about what do we do with these personalized Shakespeare apps of the different kinds. So I see digital technologies used in creative classrooms as opportunities for personalization without isolation or, for that matter, passivity in learners. Internet connectivity and 21st century digital tools can be forces for good learning by and productive community among adolescents who are studying Shakespeare. But the role of teacher may need some rethinking. I am very influenced by the work of James G. And this is one of his books, Teaching Learning Literacy in Our High-Risk, High-Tech World. Note that the subtitle is A Framework for Becoming Human, right, which is a very adjective mode that he's in. He writes, good teaching no longer resides in just one individual called a teacher. It now also resides in activity-based social systems and in smart technology. Teaching today at its best involves using multiple good technologies and good forms of social interaction and participation to design good learning experiences so that learners can know, do, and become. 21st century teachers, I would say, have to deal with the students' belief that the most important learning is elsewhere. It's on our phones. It's in the world that's outside of what's going on in our classroom and outside of school. G calls these other learning places affinity spaces, places where students find communities of others and opportunities to enrich, explore, and expand their interests. G writes, it is hard to think of a significant matter of human concern that hasn't attracted a thriving online community of problem solvers. Today, one can find affinity groups devoted to everything from citizen science to improving women's health, passing legislation, curing rare diseases, writing fan fiction, and countless other topics, including many interests that are school-like, such as affinity spaces focused on tech skills, history, and mythology. And within these affinity spaces, people are fully engaged in helping each other to learn, act, and produce, regardless of their age, place of origin, formal credentials, or level of experiences, or levels of expertise. So affinity spaces offer new ways to think about the boundaries of classrooms and teaching. Students can gain real-world audiences for their ideas and their creative work. Teachers can gain resources for good teaching and learning without needing to be the expert in all things. And I want to give you a few examples of social activity networks built around teaching Shakespeare, which I see as the natural home that builds on tools that you might use, digital tools you might use in the classroom, but then connects to something more than just an individual person kind of scrolling through and trying to get the play as fast as possible. So let me give you a couple of examples. A Shakespeare classroom can be designed for connecting, and the challenge to connect can be given to the students, not required as more preparation for the teacher. For instance, students can discover a stunning example of meaning-making available in Cry Havoc, a one-man, one-act play written and performed nationally in the U.S. by Stephen Wolford of the Bedlam Theater of New York City. The work interweaves speeches on soldiering and warfare from Julius Caesar, Coriolanus, Hamlet, and Henry V. Through these, Wolfert describes and enacts his own story of overcoming emotional and physical disabilities to become successful in the U.S. Army as a medic and as an officer, including surviving Iraqi deployment. Yet he also describes in Cry Havoc how a stateside friendly fire incident and a friend who dies in his arms leads him to go AWOL. He literally, while going AWOL, wanders into a production of Richard III, and he recognizes himself a man of ambition and injury who understands battle. Wolfert is compelling. Shakespeare's works allow him identification with characters, and this identification has helped him to heal. And beyond these performances, Wolfert and Bedlam Theater offer an ongoing program called Decruit that supports the reintegration of veterans into U.S. society through weekly acting classes. A New York Times feature describes Wolfert as teaching controlled methods of accessing charged memories. Wolfert believes Shakespeare plays are a means to understand trauma and to start coming back from it. So students can go find things like this project and see networks at work doing good and potentially a role for themselves. But another social activity network is exemplified and really inspiring in this 2017 documentary film called Romeo is Bleeding. Romeo's Bleeding offers a view into an affinity space, and it suggests how social activity networks can expand to other classrooms and be dedicated to powerful meaning-making around a Shakespeare play. In the film, Dante Clark and former English teacher Molly Rayner lead an after-school spoken word poetry and arts program in Richmond, California, an impoverished Bay Area community. Clark becomes inspired by Romeo and Juliet as a story that he and his group need to tell, but not because of lovesick teenagers. These student artists in this film create a spoken word version that portrays and responds to a deadly turf war that is chronically killing their friends and families there outside of Oakland, California. They perform their play, which they call Tay's Harmony, as a depiction of their community and a vision for what they hope can change. The documentary allows the viewer to witness the creation of play, including the intensive crafting of words and the dramatic techniques that are used in rehearsal. Painfully, at the same time, we see students losing friends to shootings. Their work together is a plea to the community to recognize the cost of the old grudges that shape their violent daily reality. The performers use spoken word poetry techniques to respond to Shakespeare and remake his language in their own expressions. They also make explicit how the wider world, the immediate community, but also its cultural history, connects his plot and their community history. For instance, the student performers know about segregation in the 1940s and how then the lack of housing defined their community. Through their poetry, they describe how, with the shipping industry booming and then shuttered, the cycles of gentrification and neglect have defined their neighborhoods and reinforced competition with and distrust of others. Gun violence is not senseless to these student artists. They use their voices and the craft and technique of spoken word poetry to make meaning of it. In the pursuit of ever-expanding social activity networks around Shakespeare play, my University of Houston project, which Liam referenced earlier, the Teaching Shakespeare in Houston project, screened Romeo's Bleeding for our community and especially for local teachers. The University of Houston College of Education is committed to increase local community involvement and to, quote, serve the community as a hub for collective action. Our Teaching Shakespeare project contributes to these efforts through collaborating across our institution, networking teachers, sharing resources, and positively disrupting Shakespeare pedagogy in local ELA classrooms. Our campus also hosted a performance of another original theater piece done by local high school students called Gun Violence, the New Normal. This didn't incorporate Shakespeare, but it was an evolution of drama that came from close work with a great Shakespeare teacher. I would like to talk with teachers at this conference about the issues your students face and how they connect their literature studies, especially in Shakespeare, to expressing their lives. Most recently, I've been working with teachers at the Young Women's College Preparatory Academy in Houston, which is a public school. It's a magnet school. We could talk about school organization if you want. But anyway, in Houston, and a wonderful, ambitious teacher who wanted to take on Titus Andronicus with them, with the students. And we reported on our experience in the English Journal back in September, so I can send you that if you want to read about it. To connect the students to the play, we expanded their network so that they spoke with feminist scholars from other universities by Skype. They interviewed actors about playing violence. They enacted the play in the classroom and later in a performance. This is part of that performance. And some of what they learned they gained during class time, and others of it through guided internet exploration. So it was whole class teaching, but also a kind of personalized pursuit of what was interesting to them. Again, I see this conference as an opportunity to brainstorm about ways to help students find and explore such connections. In the case of this school, we are currently working on taking advantage of its focus on STEM. So the College Preparatory Academy is officially a STEM school, which means science, tech, engineering, and mathematics. And the students' desire to make it a STEAM school, may add in the arts, right, to science, technology, engineering, and the arts, as well as mathematics. We, collectively, the teachers and the professors and other folks involved in this project, see many pathways for their futures as they learn to be independent and critical readers and adults. Ultimately, activity-based social systems can productively counter the conditions that isolate teachers and limit students. Shakespeare pedagogy practices can spread to different instructors, each in turn making innovative adaptations. Secondary school literature teachers can develop strategies that work best for their own students, making the Shakespeare text more accessible and the benefits available for more students and not just the bright ones. And within networks, instead of an individual teacher having to manage all this innovation alone, associations of teachers and scholars and researchers and more can support one another in arts-based innovative pedagogy. I hope this conference can be full of such promising and important connections for my students and for your students too. Thank you very much.